Its name is the red kangaroo, born blind, deaf, and smaller than a bean. By the end, you'll see how one mother runs 2 pregnancies and 2 kinds of milk at once, and why that should not be possible in a mammal. At birth, it weighs about 2 grams, a pink, half-formed thing the size of a jelly bean, with no working eyes, no ears, and hind legs that are barely nubs. And yet, with no help at all, it begins to climb. It drags itself up through a dense forest of its mother's fur, hauling with 2 clawed forelimbs, and about 3 minutes later it reaches the pouch and disappears inside. A mammal, finishing its own development outside the body that made it. No dog, no whale, no human infant could survive being born this unfinished. The mother never lifts it and never guides it. She only licks a path through her fur and lets the newborn make the journey alone. For those first minutes, it is completely on its own, a speck of pink life crossing what might as well be a mountain. Most people know that kangaroos carry their babies in a pouch. Almost no one knows why the baby has to arrive in that state, or what the pouch is really hiding. Ask anyone what makes a kangaroo unusual, and you'll get the same answer. It's a marsupial, so it raises its young in a pouch. That's the textbook line, and it isn't wrong. Kangaroos belong to a group of mammals, the marsupials, that includes koalas, wombats, and possums. Instead of carrying a baby to full term inside the womb, the mother gives birth very early and finishes the job in a pouch on her belly. The red kangaroo is the largest of them all, a male standing taller than a man and able to cover 25 feet in a single bound. For most people, that's where the story ends. Pouch equals baby carrier, a warm pocket, a place to keep the little one safe until it's big enough to hop away. It's a tidy explanation, and it's the one every nature program repeats. But the pouch is not a simple pocket, and the phrase born early is doing an enormous amount of hidden work in that sentence. How early is early? Early enough that the newborn isn't really a baby yet. It's closer to an embryo that has been evicted. The part no one expects comes later, when we look at what the mother is doing while the joey grows. And what happens inside that pouch breaks a rule that every other mammal on Earth obeys. Here's how early. A human pregnancy runs about 270 days. A red kangaroo stays pregnant for only about 33. By the time a human embryo is a barely formed cluster, the kangaroo is already giving birth. The newborn that emerges is roughly 2 centimeters long and weighs about 2 grams, less than a grape. Its back legs haven't formed. Its eyes are sealed shut. Its brain is a smooth, simple bud. By almost every measure, it is not ready to be born. And that is exactly the point. What the textbook calls birth is really a handoff. The embryo is pushed out of the womb long before it is finished, and it completes the rest of its growth latched onto a teat inside the pouch, drinking milk for months. The pouch, in other words, is a second womb turned inside out. But this raises an obvious problem. Why would evolution build an animal that gives birth to something so unfinished it can barely be called an animal? A blind, legless embryo climbing unaided looks like the worst possible design. Losing even one to a fall or a cold night should be a catastrophe. Placental mammals, us, dogs, elephants, went the other way, keeping the young inside far longer, safe and fed through a placenta. Kangaroos did the reverse. And the reason isn't a flaw. It's the rule they broke to survive a continent that keeps trying to kill them. A kangaroo pushes its own baby out of the womb after just 33 days, and it is not by choice. The reason is a rule nearly every other mammal quietly obeys. A mother's immune system attacks anything that isn't her own body. A growing embryo is half its father, foreign tissue, so by that rule the mother should reject it like an infection. Placental mammals evolved a workaround. The placenta, a living barrier that hides the embryo and lets it stay inside for months. Kangaroos never fully evolved that barrier. Their thin, short-lived placenta can only shield the embryo for a few weeks. So rather than fight that limit, they beat it. They give birth before the immune clock runs out and finish raising the young in the pouch. It sounds like a downgrade, a failure to evolve the full placenta the rest of us carry. For nearly a century, that is how biologists framed it. Marsupials as the rough draft of real mammals, a stalled halfway step on the road to us. But that framing is backwards, and the next layer is where it falls apart completely. Because the short pregnancy isn't the end of the mother's trick. It's the doorway to something no placental animal can do at all. Here is what that century of framing missed. A female red kangaroo is almost never running just one pregnancy. While a tiny joey is latched inside the pouch, drinking and growing, the mother can already be carrying a second embryo in her womb, paused, fertilized a few dozen cells, and then simply stopped, frozen in place, waiting, sometimes for months. Biologists call it embryonic diapause. She holds this backup embryo in suspended animation, and only when the pouch joey grows big enough to leave does the paused embryo switch back on, finish developing, and get born, right as the older one hops out. She runs her young on a conveyor belt. At one moment, a single female can be tending 3 young at once, one hopping at her side, one latched in the pouch, and one paused in the womb. And it gets stranger. She is often feeding 2 offspring at the same time, a newborn on one teat, and an older joey, now out of the pouch, on another. From those 2 teats, she produces 2 completely different milks at once, one thin and sugar-rich for the tiny newborn, one thick and fat-rich for the older, hopping joey. 2 recipes, 2 nozzles, 1 body. This is the reveal the pouch was hiding. She isn't a mammal that failed to evolve a long pregnancy. She's a mammal that turned reproduction into a factory line, and the primitive label had it exactly upside down. A kangaroo can put a pregnancy on hold for months, then switch it back on the moment the rain returns. Australia's outback lurches between brutal drought and sudden green, and a long pregnancy is a terrible bet there. Start one in a drought, and it can starve halfway through. The paused embryo is the escape hatch. When drought bites, a mother can even abandon the joey in her pouch to save herself, and lose almost nothing, because a fully formed backup embryo is still waiting in the womb. The instant conditions improve, that embryo restarts, and within weeks a new newborn is climbing to the pouch. She never gambles on one long pregnancy. She keeps a queue and plays whichever card the weather deals. Once you see that, the whole primitive marsupial story collapses. Giving birth to an embryo was never a failure to build a placenta. It was the doorway to a paused pregnancy, parallel milk, and a reproductive system that bends to a land too unpredictable for ours. The rest of us are locked into a single long pregnancy we cannot stop or start at will. The kangaroo can pause, stack, and reschedule its children around the ring. The one rule it broke, carry your young to term inside the body, is the very rule that would have killed it here. We call them primitive because they carry their young in a pocket, but the pocket is the most flexible cradle any mammal has ever built.